Hello, I'm Jeff Rusco, instructional designer and technologist, and welcome to another episode of COG, a show where we look at why we learn, why we don't, and some of the things that make the difference. And I'm joined today again by my colleague Alan Greatorex. In today's show, we're going to look at the difference between awareness level training and mastery and why corporations sometimes choose the former over the latter, specifically when it comes to compliance training.
Sure. Hi, Jeff. Hi, everyone. The concept I came across, I was speaking with a senior leader in a large financial services company, and she said, the problem with this company is we really only train for awareness, not mastery. And I thought, that's interesting. It's a very interesting insight from a business person. So I thought about that. And I think what she was meaning is that when people in the corporate world go to a training event or have a training experience, it's usually brief. And in fact, over the time that I've been in training, which is a few decades, the pressure on training experts has been to reduce the amount of time spent in training dramatically. When I first started, you could spend 4 or 5 days in a classroom learning a skill, or a concept, a skill, and then practicing it. Now people are saying, can you get that done in 2 hours? Can you get that done in half an hour? In fact, do we even really need to go to training? Can't you just send us an email? And I think the consequence of that is that we've made people aware of a lot of great ideas and information, whether it's in leadership, or interpersonal skills, or corporate culture, whatever subject matter you care to choose. The assumption is that we can cram this information into somebody's head in the shortest time possible. And then when they leave, we hope that there'll be some sort of transfer into the real world. But I think what we've seen is people are aware of things. If you went around any corporate office and you said, tell me about a particular interpersonal skill or emotional intelligence or communication or active listening or you name it, you think of all these concepts we've looked at over the years. And people will say, let me see, it had something to do with something.
Listening.
Yeah.
See, it's the bad elevator speech,
right,
the
exactly.
Dummies Guide to these things. So
and
my question, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that in contrast, I think some organizations like the military train for mastery. And by that, I mean they train people to the extent that they can perform a skill with almost unconsciously. And, we all have that experience in our daily lives. It might be driving a car, playing a musical instrument. It might be a craft or a hobby that we're particularly good at. And the reason that we're good at it is that we've invested significant amounts of time and a few other elements which we can talk about. But I think there's a big difference. And I wonder, the big question in my mind is, are we hoping for awareness? Are we hoping for mastery? And are we doing our training to match what our hope is, right? Are we hoping that people are just vaguely aware of some idea, or do we expect them to be able to master that knowledge or that skill?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, and let me kind of break some of this down from my understanding, and I have some questions too about sort of what you mean. My one main question is, should corporations be training for mastery? And maybe we could, and I think you have explained it in context, what you mean by mastery, and awareness training, because I think a lot of instructional designers will be listening to this. So we're kind of talking about like the evaluation part of Bloom's taxonomy, and especially for what is the corporation trying to gain with this. So when you mention the military, that's something very different, right? The training is baked into military service. That's part of what the military does. You take most corporations and they're not in the business of training, because you're supposed to come into it as a fully trained soldier, right? As having the skill set to meet the position already. We're not generally professional roles and positions and things like that. They're the type of training that we do seems like it's just kind of like a little nudge. We're not actually giving people or want people to have mastery of something. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. I think ideally we assume that mastery is the goal when it comes to things like interpersonal skills or leadership and management of others. Anything in the difficult space, right? I think that's also true. I think we hope for mastery when it comes to on the job process skills. But fortunately, one of the things that's necessary for mastery is much more likely to happen for process related skills, perhaps using a computer or following a process, is practice. You'll get lots and lots of practice and you'll get very quick feedback on errors. So uh, I think in some areas, corporations are hoping for mastery and perhaps are doing more to make it a reality. I think on the leadership and the interpersonal skills side, I think there's less acknowledgement and less willingness to support mastery. And I'll give you a quick example. I taught a course recently, a management and leadership skills course, and we were constantly being pushed to reduce the amount of time in the classroom.
Yeah.
It started out as a 5-day event. We got it down to 3 days. And even 3 days was looked at with kind of a jaundiced view that that's a long time. And I said, well, we are trying to get these people to fundamentally change the way they lead others, which is probably the single most important task of management in the company. And the the compromise was that we had this cadre of learners come back 6 times every 6 weeks
Hmm.
to uh, review and reinforce the content that they learn.
That
And
actually
during
sounds like
those
a good model, actually.
right, and during those 6 week periods, those intervals between getting back together physically, we gave them assignments, homework, and a
Hmm.
big part of the program was this commitment to following through with your homework. And I have to say that at the end of that, we got the full cadre of learners back for a celebratory lunch and a discussion about what they'd learned. And I was amazed at how much of the content they not only retained, but could speak about with a great degree of certainty and sophistication. And this is the sort of content that usually the trainer is the expert, and the learners kind of vaguely wander out of the classroom going, yeah, I think it
Yeah.
was a 4 parts to the model. I don't remember, but these folks really nailed it, and that to me was the one of the very few examples I've had in my career of the organisation being willing to support the view of building mastery.
Yeah, I think that's a good example and a good model. And if corporations even look at that, it seems like the lift or the level of effort involved in that. Do you think that was looking back on the model of a week straight or this 1 day or every 6 weeks? What is it about an equal level of effort there? Because I'm thinking from a corporate perspective, they'll be looking at cost and time away from not making money.
Right, absolutely, and that's the constant discussion with business leaders is uh, why are we doing this training? Generally speaking, and I think there's a there's an interesting dialogue that goes on between business leaders and training people, and that is around, well, how much money am I going to spend on training and lose in terms of productivity compared with what outputs and what outcomes I could expect from the training experience. And I think the pushback from a training professional has to be, look, do you want the best return on your investment? Then you've got to do it properly. You've got to be supportive of mastery as a goal in order to achieve the return on your investment. Because you can spend $2,000 sending somebody to a 2-day course, and in the week after they get back, they remember almost nothing and they
Yes.
implement even less. You spend double that by having the person go through what as we in the trade would say, spaced practice, right? Coming back every few weeks, reinforcing the content. And after doing that 6 times, six tends to be a bit of a magic number for this sort of thing. By doing something 6 times, you'll get 90% retention and application on the job. So I think ultimately you save money by spending a little bit more, and you certainly get a much better return on your investment. And the behaviour of these leaders was dramatically different by the end of this experience, which lasted, almost a year in total from when they first entered the program to when they graduated. So, and I think it's a short-sighted view, and of course I'd say that because I'm a training guy, but it's a short-sighted view to say, well, what's the quickest way that I can give these people a kind of inoculation or a vaccine in the hope that it'll work for the rest of their lives, compared
Yeah,
with
it's kind of like knowing what you can go, and I just learned this lesson on the microphone, knowing what you can go cheap on, right? And knowing what you actually get benefits from a little bit of higher investment. Right. So
right,
if you
right,
spend a little bit of money on something that doesn't work, you just threw that out, right? You get no return on that. But if you
exactly.
spend, yeah. So you know what I'm saying there. Um, so what I was going to ask is, and that was management style, right? Leadership competencies, which I would imagine, corporations do need people with a mastery of that. Um, what other topics do you think? Because obviously, not everything, right? You would train to a mastery level, or are you saying we should? Because, what I'm talking about is identifying the level of knowledge a person needs on a certain topic.
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think corporations default to awareness in the area of compliance.
Mm.
But I think one of the reasons they do that is that what it's hard, I think, for a compliance professional, whether it's based in the business or in the training function in the compliance group, to identify what would mastery look like. And I think that there are, again, parallels in our ordinary everyday lives. I do my own tax return, but between tax returns, I have almost no understanding or memory for what the tax rules
Yeah,
are.
the same.
And so
Oh,
every
so
year I have to re up my skills and my knowledge and my insights on the tax return to be able to complete it correctly. Now, flip side, let's pretend that I decided to become a tax advisor and I was doing it every day. There's a very different level of knowledge and expertise required, and it really does have to become second nature. And I think that's the difference, right? That's the analysis that we have to perform. To what extent do we need the employee to perform this skill or be aware of this law, regulation, whatever it may be, as part of their everyday experience? And to what extent do we simply say, you know what, it's enough that they know that there's some rule about doing this or not doing this, and then they can reflect back to it when they need it. I think that's part of the analysis, and I think perhaps in the compliance space, maybe awareness is okay, or at least in some subset of the compliance.
Yeah, I think that's it. I don't think
Arena.
that there is one thing because compliance, depending on the industry, there's a lot of different. Yeah, if you're selling to a government organization, it has to be this kind of product or whatnot. But I think the really juicy stuff is, and this is stuff that interests me, and I think interests you as well, are the underlying attitudes, right, and the underlying morality, really. So, what is the core compliance skills, and what would you want mastery on? And really, it is recognizing when there's a question, recognizing situations that get your spidey senses tingling, your morality senses tingling, and then to know where to go. And I think that's something that we focused on when we worked together, or tried to anyway, to get people to do that. And so you don't need to know for most jobs, right? Say like, well, maybe FINRA is a bad example because you really do kind of need to know everything there, but all the ins and outs of say like gifts, entertainment, right? You just need to know if you're in that type of situation to pause for a moment and check and think on it and look up the policy and ask somebody. So that seems to be the mastery. But how can you set up a program that's a mastery for business ethics?
Right. Again, it's a good question. I think business leaders probably, and employees themselves, probably have a good sense of what they need to be masters of when it comes to compliance and what's simply adequate to be aware of. Uh,
Uh, I just thought of something. Let me just tell a story while it's still in my head.
yeah,
Talking about, and this was something that our old boss would talk about. I remember he talked about people that when they pull into parking lots go over the line, right? That they're actually shown, and there's some studies, that. And I'm thinking of Dan Ariely's work, the fudge factor, how everybody cheats just a little bit, right? And that sometimes how we act on small things. And this is what I was thinking of. So before, one time when I was looking for a job, I had interviewed in a bunch of places and received an offer from a large finance company. And this is right before the financial crisis of 2008. This is like late 2007. And I turned them down for an odd reason. And I told the recruiter this um, because I had shared an office with one of their field offices, right? And there was a shared bathroom there. And their brokers never washed their hands after using the bathroom. And that's gross, for one. And for two, I'm thinking, how does that translate then into how they carry themselves in business? And I had no proof, at the time. But like referring to Dan Ariely's work, some things support that. And it turned out that this particular company was, yes, a couple weeks later after I turned down the offer, everybody I had talked to had been let go, fired. The company is still barely around, but it was really one of the bad actors in that whole scenario.
right. So it was an indicator that behaviour that you observed was an indicator of an
Well,
ongoing culture.
yes, yeah, and that's kind of my not question or observation. Like I said, it's anecdotal, but there has been, and I'd have to look up. I could put links to studies that kind of back this up on our webpage. But yeah, it's an interesting question. So if you're going to train that, besides putting a sign that says "Please wash your hands" before returning to your desks where you're making money, um, yeah, that is where I think uh, there's a lot of different ways you can go. And for something like that, cultural things, right? I don't know exactly what the right approach would be, but it might not be the same thing as for, say, leadership skills, like you were talking about. So when you talk about the culture of compliance or culture of honesty and things like that, that's where I think we can sort of look at training not as training, education not as education, and more as creating social norms through advertising, for instance, through events, through dialogue, right? So, and I think it takes more, I don't know if it takes more thought, but it takes different thinking. And then, two, looking, seeing if that works, because even something like that would be a tricky thing to tell an auditor or a regulator if they came and said, "Did you do this training?" Well, we had an ad campaign, right? But what are
Right.
your thoughts on that?
There's got to be a thoughtful analysis of what we can afford to just target awareness and what really requires mastery or approaches mastery. And I think you're right. There's a couple of examples you gave which are I think common in the thinking of compliance professionals, which is the there are really only a couple of things we have to be able to do. One is know when we don't know what to do
Yes.
next. Consult your compliance officer early and often. And I think so. So in a sense, it's knowing when you're out of your own depth. But I think too that most business people would know the compliance stuff that they have to have down cold because it's part of their
Hmm.
everyday experience. Perhaps it's trading rules, and anyone who's on the trading desk knows the rules because it's part of their
Right.
everyday experience. The same way, if you think about driving a car, well, sadly, some of us not seem to know the rules and obey them because we do it very frequently. And then there seems to be a great portion of the population that doesn't know the rules, and that's a whole other story. But my point really is simply to say that I think practice is a key component to mastery. In fact, it's an essential component. And for those areas of skill or knowledge that are necessary for compliance, for someone to be compliant, if they're doing it every day, that's the practice element taken
Mm.
care of. On the other hand, I'll give an example, perhaps Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I've never been in a role where I even had the slightest chance of breaching the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act guidance regulations. So even though I was aware of FCPA and I had a sense of what it was trying to achieve and what was allowed and not allowed, I never had to know it with any sense of mastery because it just didn't impact my role. On the other hand, if something came up in my role that was unexpected or unusual, maybe I was using
Hmm.
a vendor in another country
That's
for
what I
the
was
first
thinking of.
time, the, the fact that I was aware of FCPA regulation would cause me to pause for a moment and think, oh, wait a minute, do I need to get some help here? Because this may be against the rules, but I'm not an expert. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to raise people's consciousness of something so that they know when they're out of their depth, unless it's something that they do every day, in which case we do require mastery. So I think a compliance professional could probably work out for the business that they support which areas need to be mastered and which areas can we can afford to just train for awareness.
Well, that's interesting. And I like that FCPA example because most people, unless they are dealing in a lot of foreign transactions or overseas businesses and stuff like that, they think, oh, they don't really think about it, nor do they have to a point. But I like what you said about a vendor, and not even just a vendor, but like what the vendor's actions do, right? So, say that you or I, and we're outsourcing something, say training development or something like that to a vendor, and so we're setting up a classroom, right, in another country and we're asking them, so is it on time? Is it on schedule? Is everything done? And and they say something like, yes, yes, yeah, yeah. Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. My uncle's brother's cousin is in the Ministry of Buildings, and we can get the permit. Right, we're just going to send them a little gift. I mean, it wouldn't be that obvious, but just and that's where it's like again that core skill is you don't need to know the letter and be able to recite the FCPA law. You just have to know certain key pieces. And I think as compliance trainers, identifying what those are is one of the most critical things. So what do they need to know? They need to know that vendor actions, even if the vendor themselves doesn't have any government officials in there, but there are actions, right? That has to, even what they do, has to be within that law. So that would be the key piece. And that's where I think scenarios come into play. But then again, it's kind of like mixed things because, like the traditional model of having all these scenarios packaged together on 10 different compliance topics 2 minutes after they get through that. I mean, it's basically just hurdles. I think like that model as the employee looks at it as like, oh, okay, click, 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 click. I call it the Morse code learning, right? Because they're clicking just to get through it, and they don't care if it's right or wrong. They just want to get to
Right.
that
Right.
end goal. So that's, I think, is one of the challenges when we identify not just, okay, not just that there's an FCPA and it means that you can't bribe on non-American officials, but it's fine for American officials. No, kidding, but it is kind of funny the way it's worded. But like, what in that, say the FCPA, what are the 3 or 4, no more than that, right? 3 or 4 key skills that you need, right? What do you have to be able to identify? Where do you go once you identify it?
One of the things you spoke about, Jeff, is people trying to click through the training to get it done as quickly as possible. And I understand that. I think all compliance trainers are aware that compliance training is often seen as a necessary evil, or if not that extreme, then kind of something I should just have to get done, even if I'm not really sure why I'm doing it. And I think, I used to say it's like going to the dentist. We all know we have to do it, but it's not actually that pleasant of an experience. And yet, I think that speaks to one of the elements that is necessary for mastery, which I call motivation. In other words, is the learner motivated to learn? And there are unlimited examples of this, but one that I particularly like is when you think about school kids, little
Mhm.
kids, and you think, well, they can't remember their times tables, or they can't remember the states in the United States, or they can't remember the presidents in the right order, but they can tell you the name of every Pokemon and what sound it makes and what it morphs into. Or they can tell you the names of every football player or every
Mhm.
baseball player on a particular team for the last 5 years. So it's certainly not as a result of a lack of intelligence or a lack of uh, memory skills. It's motivation that changes the picture dramatically. And yep,
Yes, and in that example, and then I'll let you get back to it. But something that I think the other side of that coin, right, and something that I think helps in motivation. I know helps in motivation is another one of my sayings is content is king, right? So if you have good content and a good design, right? So why, why besides being cool, is it more fun? Or do they invest the time to know the Pokemon or the Digimon or whatever mon is popular right now? And and not the states, and part of it obviously is you look at the medium, the Pokemon are cool and they have lights and stuff like that. And I think to a certain extent, not that you have to make everything a cartoon, but you have to make the content and the design engaging uh, enough that people want to find out what happens next. People want to progress it. People kind of get sucked into it a little bit.
motivation to learn is a really critical thing, and that as most of us now know, adults in particular, children are a little different. Children are somewhat motivated to learn simply because most of what they're learning is novel, and uh, even even schoolwork has some degree of interest inherently because it's new and different when you're quite young. But uh, I think for adults, we have to think about um, whether or not the adult sees the value of what they're learning to solve a problem. And I know you and I have spoken
Mhm.
about this over the years, that a great question that an adult learner really wants
Yeah.
answered is, what problem does this solve for me? And I think to our experience every day, where we face a problem in life and we immediately go to YouTube or we go to Google to see how somebody else has solved that
Yes.
problem, whether it's tiling a bathroom floor or attaching exactly attaching a hitch to your car. If you've never done it before, you want to go and look at what other people have done. But what's interesting is you want the shortest possible video with the clearest, most succinct explanation, and then you want to rush right out and try it. You're very highly motivated to achieve success and to learn, but only in short, digestible pieces. You're not interested in learning the history of tow hitches from 1812 to today, and you're not really interested in learning about how to make a tow hitch or what color to paint it. You're just saying, just give me the little piece I need so I can solve this problem. And I think that's a big part of how adults learn. What's the little piece they need to know to solve their immediate problem? And that feeds into motivation, which then feeds to a willingness to develop mastery.
You're absolutely, and that actually reminds me of a thought I had earlier in this, and something that I think companies do not do well at all. And I was thinking of that almost the same exact thing is like when you look at most corporations' policies, and we've delved deeply, by working together into policies. And our one of our jobs was to interpret the policy and pull out pieces and put it in easy to understand language and give examples and teach that way. But the problem is that, like, just like the example of like with the hitch and the bike rack I put in, it was jiggling, and I want to know why it's jiggling, what I could do to solve it, right? So I went to YouTube, found the part, watched just that bit, got it. I missed that. That's what I need. So imagine like corporate policies and principles and all that jazz in that kind of format, right? So and you wouldn't even assign this stuff, right? So imagine this model, and I'm just kind of brainstorming now, where you have like say an awareness or a certain amount of set training just to get people to understand when they need to go to get more information. And imagine just that if you could just type in, okay, uh, can I accept this gift from a vendor? And just put it in like you would a Google search.
No, absolutely. That's exactly right. If compliance training folks could identify the the quick learning things that people need and make them readily accessible, that's perfect. To me, that is the perfect compliance training program. Just the information I need,
Yeah.
exactly when I need it. And unfortunately, I think compliance training, and you and I both have been in that field for a long time. I think we've adopted a medical model, and it's funny. I mean, we talked about coronavirus last week, but in the current climate, everyone's desperately looking for a vaccine. In other words, if I can just have one very short, unpleasant experience that will protect me for the rest of my life, I'll go for it.
Yeah, the vaccine
Right.
analogy of training, the multi spectrum vaccine in one shot. Get the shot, and then you're good.
Exactly. Whereas I think what you and I are talking about, which certainly goes toward mastery, is this idea of what if we could put all of the compliance information that we think our employees need into a YouTube or a Google like experience where you just find the piece you need just when you need it. You're very highly motivated to access it, and you're very, very likely to apply it in the real world. And that, I think, goes against what our typical experience is and perhaps what regulators have traditionally looked for, which is annual compliance training, whether you need it or not.
Whether you need it or not. And that's another piece of the puzzle. It's something that I'm personally struggling with right now because regulators come in and say, show me when they have taken this training. And now this model that we're doing is a drip model of micro learning based on competency, and it has a moving average of people's performance. It is much better than the one time, one shot, you got everything. But what the one time, one shot, you got everything has, when the regulator comes in, says, show me who took this when. Boom, you could just do a report. Did they learn? No, they didn't. So that's the dark underbelly of compliance training. It is the service agreement model where you scroll through pages and pages of legalese, and then you sign your life away saying, yes, I understand every single word of this. It's in the core of my being. Let me just click this friggin' button, hit submit, and move on. And that's what regulators look for
Well,
the most
traditionally
part.
they certainly have, and I think in a lot of cases we're sort of sneaking up on. Sorry, we're sneaking up on a much more informed and insightful approach to compliance training. And what I mean by that is, in the past, we thought of compliance, whether it was from inside the company or outside from a regulator's point of view, we thought about it as like sitting an exam, repeating the same content every year. AML springs to mind as an example of that in particular, which
It's
doesn't
anti-money laundering.
really understand how adults learn or how they retain and apply knowledge or skill. If you think about everything else we do in life, the model is small, frequently accessed chunks, lots of reinforcement, lots of practice, right? Nobody remembers anything if they don't practice it on a regular basis. And that is not because they're lazy or they don't want to do the right thing. It's simply right. And in fact, if we go back to some of the brain science behind all this, we all know. Well, for years, as I was growing up, I was told that when we dream, we are filtering and storing information. But the much more recent research suggests that, in fact, we're not doing that at all. What we're doing is disposing of unnecessary information. That our REM state, right, that
Really?
our REM state sleep is when the brain is actually eliminating unnecessary content. And the best example, and I want everybody to try this right now, try and remember what you had for dinner last night. Most of us can't remember what we did
Uh,
last night. And even if you can, try going back 2 nights or 3 nights and you can't.
yeah.
And the reason you can't is that the brain is constantly eliminating unnecessary or irrelevant information. One of the reasons we do that, the brain does that, and I'm not saying brains are somehow separate from who we are, but one of the chemical processes going on in the brain is that it's always looking for the most streamlined, efficient way to process things because brains, not needless to say, use a lot
Uh-huh.
of energy and information. They need lots of resources to operate
A third
effectively.
a third of our
Right,
calories go toward.
exactly. And so for that reason, they're constantly sifting and sorting out useless information. Now, you compare that, right, not being able to remember what we ate for breakfast yesterday or the day before, 3 days, a week, forget about it, unless a couple of things apply. One, it was a special event. It was something memorable because it was a unique and unusual experience. Or two, we can rely on practice. We can say, well, I have the same breakfast every day. I always have bacon and eggs with 2 pieces of toast. That's my standard breakfast, and I can guarantee I had it yesterday because I always have it. And that speaks to two other principles. One is this concept of a novel and unique experience that is somehow salient, that stands out from the background, or something that we practice repeatedly on a constant basis so it becomes second nature. And another good example, I think, is every one of us now these days can remember our childhood telephone number. If we had a phone in our homes, our parents' house, we can usually remember the phone number, even though the last time we used it was 45 years ago. Whereas I couldn't tell you my own cell phone number because I don't use it anymore. I don't need to repeat
Mm.
that number on a regular basis. So there are examples, I think, many examples in our experience of what shifts something into long term memory and what re- makes it just
Yes.
short term or not even short term memory.
No. Yeah, that's very much true, and it reminded me of an experience that I had. where I was teaching a class about customer service and some fundamentals of customer service from this guy's materials. Christopher Bell, I think his name was, a really brilliant guy, and I was teaching one of his classes. And as I am teaching, there was a leak in this is a building in New York. One of the pipes burst, right? And the wall started just getting soaked with water. And, and of course, everybody's looking at that. And I'm like, you see, that's why we need good customer service, or else our customers will leak away. And of course, it was a little chuckle there. And I'm like, and I'm guarantee you now that you're going to remember this class and at least remember that phrase because something unexpected happened. And that kind of lodges into your memory because it's the only class you'll probably ever be in where you had water pouring down the wall.
Right.
And
Exactly.
so,
Yeah.
so you think in that example, and I try to incorporate this in my designs too, but then you always have, especially when you're trying to do something that's a little esoteric, and management gets it. They're like, well, why do you have this in there? It's like, wow, you know, the more relevant, the more stimuli, right? And if you could somehow then make it like that was just popped into my head when I saw it there, just because I saw it as that teachable moment. Not that it was even related, but just if I could associate the training with the stimuli, it'll become part of that memory engram, if they're still using that turn of phrase to talk about memory.
Right,
So
exactly. And so there's that salience concept, right? That it stood out from my previous experiences, so I remember it better.
yeah, and it's so fascinating what you said about, and it makes sense. I mean, I'm going to look that up, after our podcast, because there's an interesting way to look at dreams. And when you think about one feature of dreams that always seems odd, well, two things. One is there'll be some detail in there, and then if you trace that image back, it comes from the most irrelevant thing, which makes me think that what you said might be true, right? So, like I remember I had a dream that I saw a crack in the sky, and then I try and trace that image down. Then I remember, like a week prior, there was a crack in the pavement that I dropped a screw in. All right, you know. So it seems like, yeah, it is just okay. Things we don't need, pushing
Right.
out. And the other thing is, the dreams are some, like about 90% of the dreams. When you wake up and you have that feeling that it's fading, because it literally is, and I forget what hormone or what process does it, but the brain is like flushing it
Right.
away, and you're trying to
Yeah.
hold on to it, and it's
Yeah.
going, no, there was,
Yeah.
there was,
That's right.
it's
And it's
gone.
funny you should say you forget what hormone it is, right? Because that's a piece of
Yeah.
information you learned at some point, or you were exposed to that information at some point in your life. It wasn't salient or relevant to what you were doing. It was interesting, but it wasn't
Hmm.
something you needed to refer to on a regular basis, and so you lose it. And the brain is constantly doing that. And we all have that experience. Every single person listening to this podcast can think of things that they know they once knew, but they no longer know. Which is crazy, right? You go, and
Mhm.
that sort
It
of
is.
speaks
It's
to
so
that whole mastery thing. The mastery, to me, a great definition of mastery is something that you'll never forget, no matter what. And for me,
mm.
it's my childhood
Yeah, but
phone
when it
number.
comes
It's how to ride a bike. It's
uh,
how to play a particular musical instrument. Nothing could happen to me
drums,
that I would forget that, short of a brain injury, perhaps. But
but not maybe not even that. And let me tell you just this, and then I'll let you say the but, because this reminded me of a very interesting thing, and I forget what program I listened to it on, but it was talking about Alzheimer's, and there was this professor, and even I forget what he was a professor of, but he was losing his mind. But yet, if you asked him about this theory, he would go into his lecture for about 40 minutes and perfectly describe it. But then he didn't know how to tie his shoes.
exactly, that's exactly the example. Now, I think that's, to go back to something we've spoken about a few times on this podcast, what I think the implications are for the training professional in the compliance space, but perhaps anywhere. perhaps in any context, is to think about how do I categorize the knowledge and the skills and even the attitudes that I'm trying to instill in my learner. Is it awareness only? Is it mastery? Or is it somewhere on a sliding scale? And therefore, what strategies do I need to employ? And I think we've touched on a lot of them, Jeff, and there's probably 5 more podcasts content here, but we could talk about how do I make the content stand out from the background? How do I incorporate practice in my training so that people it's reinforced, massed and spaced practice, that old classic from cognitive
Mm,
psychology, right? If I space out the amount of time people are practicing, they learn it better. Um, the the concept of relevance, right? How does it solve a problem for the learner? Because they'll refer to it more quickly. We've spoken about the idea of compliance on demand, right? Just the piece of information you need just when you need it. So lots of interesting concepts there to noodle on, but starts, I think, with analysis and not assuming that every piece of compliance content should be delivered in a particular way because it's all either equally important or equally relevant. I don't think that's the case at all.
absolutely. Well, thank you. I think that wraps up another episode. Thank you, Alan, so much. I think we covered a lot of ground here, a lot of interesting ideas, and I hope everybody will join us next week for another fine
Yeah,
episode.
thanks, Jeff. Let's talk next week.